Elevated Grapes Podcast.
Elevated Grapes Podcast.
With your host, Sethi.
Your host, Sethi.
And Stylist Rashi Bindra.
It's time to get started.
Let's talk fashion, shall we?
Okay, welcome to Elevated Grapes. I am your host, Sethi, and that's really, really loud. I'll back off a little bit.
You were that excited?
Okay, so hold on. We need about 2 minutes for Rashi's introduction because she goes into all the details of what her roles are. So Rashi, your 2 minutes begins now.
This is your fashion consultant and stylist, Rashi Bindra, and we, as in you and I, are your co-host for today's episode.
Oh, that one only took 35 seconds.
I'm going to kill you.
Yeah. Then I won't be here. Then you can be co-host by yourself.
I do not want to be co-host by
You can
myself.
sit on this chair and then jump over to this chair and then jump over to that chair and have just a whole discussion with yourself, which you do sometimes.
I don't do that.
Totally have discussions with yourself. Sometimes like she'll be messaging and literally go through a whole discussion, ask questions, answer them, give the reasons, and then respond to the reasons as well. And then I come back to my phone half an hour later and I'm like, okay, because I really don't need to put any input in because Rashi's answered all her own questions.
Well, no, because when I message you, you're like not there, and sometimes like you're my like sounding board, and sometimes I like need your expert opinion.
But do you when you answer it yourself?
You don't need anybody sometimes.
You just go through and you finish the answer yourself, and you're like, I'm good. I got this. I'm Rashi Bindra. Hashtag creative. Hashtag style consultant. Hashtag creative director. Hashtag this. Hashtag that.
I don't do hashtag all of those things. Okay?
Well, you should because it's all.
I
in
just do
Instagram.
Rashi Styles.
Yeah.
There you go.
So today we're going to have an interesting discussion on exactly what we're doing right now. Not babbling, but podcasting.
You were babbling.
Yeah, I babble. But we're podcasting, and A, the benefits of it, and B, does it really help? Does it really help? Does it really help the branding for your, whether it's a business, a product, or if you're, generally just trying to put out digital content, because there's different forms and ways to do it. So we're actually going to go through a bit of a top 10 list as well. That Rashi is going to direct and has got some information on. So we're going to use that.
I'm directing that?
Yep. You're co-host. You got to
Are
take
you
part
doing anything in
Absolutely.
this podcast?
I'm babbling.
Oh dear God.
So we're gonna go through a top 10 list of top 10 reasons why podcasts are important to your brand. But before we jump into the top 10 list, let's sort of just go through our own personal opinions because part of podcasting is really just providing opinions. And that's what a lot of podcasters do. Mm-hmm. So let's share our personal opinions on whether we feel that this is a beneficial / important way to reach out to an audience.
Oh, you're asking me that?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
This is what hosts do. They ask questions.
This is not my field. This is yours.
Exactly. But you call yourself a co-host. I'm just saying.
This was supposed to be our thing. That's why.
Yeah, no. I'll give my opinion as well. But if you want to start, because usually your opinions are the ones that are a little bit more interesting and exciting. We'll use those two terms to describe them.
Anyways, yes, to an extent, I do think podcasts help, but I think the reason why they help is that one, people love giving opinions. People also love to share their knowledge.
By people, you're talking about yourself.
I'm talking about people and other people who run podcasts, but okay.
I'm just saying because you do give opinions quite regularly.
I give opinions to my friends who ask my opinions. I don't just
sometimes they don't ask.
You ask my opinion all the time.
And sometimes I don't ask and I still get it. That's my point.
Yeah, well, you're a different story. Anyways, so people love to give their opinions. They love to share knowledge. Some people love to teach. Some people love to educate, and some people just like to feel important, that they matter. And
so let's talk about exactly that, because I was going to touch on that for the exact topic. So people like to give their opinions. Some people like to share their knowledge. So do we look into this market space as underqualified over delivering? Because underqualified and still delivering. Like you're providing content and quote unquote knowledge and quote unquote opinions on various different topics. I mean, people podcast about politics, they podcast about economics, they podcast about we're doing fashion and style and industry type topics. People podcast on self-improvement and awareness and all those sort of things. But they may not be in a position to be doing and providing some of those opinions and providing some of that quote unquote knowledge. It's just like Wikipedia. I mean, you put things, anybody can write anything on there. The barriers to entry for podcasting are very low. It's really easy to do it once you figure out how easy it is. It really doesn't take much, and you can do it at an extremely affordable amount of cost too. So it's quite accessible to almost anybody. So for those that are providing that knowledge / opinion, how credible it is and how much can we rely on this content that's being provided?
I think that goes to one, the consumers who are listening.
Yeah.
And they actually play a huge role, because really, if you think about it from a society point of view, we have gotten a bit lazy. Like, a lot of us don't like to read. We rather hear audiobooks.
I'm an 100% audiobook person.
Yeah, we rather hear podcasts.
You're a straight paperback, like you love to read.
I not only do I love to read, I also end up researching who I'm reading, because if I'm gonna take all this knowledge in and apply this to my life, like, you need to be like credible. I don't want some random, like, hey, I woke up today and decided to, like tell you how I felt, and that's how I changed my life all the time.
Let me actually speak to that.
But that's for me personally.
But you make a point there, right? Like, so let's just say that there is a random who maybe is very good at delivering content. Maybe speaks very well, has a very engaging manner to provide content. What is your expectation from something? Maybe they're not, they're not qualified in the field that they're talking about, but they're very good at delivering content.
But you have to question sometimes what you listen to, right? Like, there's okay, so not. And I think also one of the other things is that, and I know I'm jumping topics here like a little bit.
You're totally jumping.
Is that people also think doing podcast is very like glamorous, and they feel like, oh, I'm interviewing this person, I'm interviewing that. But really, at the end of the day, it comes down to what you are, like, how valuable your knowledge is, and it comes down to the consumer as to how much they are questioning what they are listening to. There is, like, just going on Spotify alone, if I type in certain types of podcasts, I'll get a bunch of things. Some of them, and so actually a example is that, because I do certain self-work for my own self and my own growth, I went on Spotify to find a podcast that would speak to it more.
Speak to that, yeah.
And just
it's a topic of interest to you at this stage.
And not because I'm driving or something, just because sometimes I'm at home and I have my notebook and I actually take notes of the podcast that I listen to. And then what this person was telling me, I'm like, I questioned it, because I was like, this is not making sense. Yes, she's doing a very high level, touch on these topics, but for the way she's marketing, this is my podcast, this is what I do, this is my, education and blah, 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 that was not, shown in the podcast or felt in the podcast. So as a consumer, I question that. And I think that's part of your role, is that you need to question what you're listening to.
So the reason I asked that question, because there are some podcasters that I listen to also that, I've researched them and not qualified for the roles that they're playing in on their podcast. Like, they're not qualified in those fields, but they're very good at delivering content. I still continue to listen to them. It's because when I did my research on them, what they do is they do a lot of research, like you mentioned. Like, it's not glamour, right? There's a lot of work that goes on in the background. They do a lot of research, and they provide content based on other people's research, which to me is not necessarily a bad thing, because I may or may not have had access to some of that research or known about it without these people providing that podcast content. Now, if it's someone who's just spewing out opinion without any fact or knowledge, that's very different. It's also very dangerous, because now there are people who are listening who may not go into the detail of researching and figuring out, like, is this person qualified? Have they done the research? Like, I know for us, for example, certain topics we may not have the most knowledge in, but we will do our research. We'll get our links. We'll get our sources, but then we'll always cite our sources so that.
And we also mention that in our podcast.
Of course, and it's very important. But some podcasters don't do that, right? Yeah. So I think it's important. I think even if a podcaster is just very good at delivering content, and they have that means to be on air, and you listen to their voice, and they're very good at delivery. That's great, and I think that's it should be encouraged, but I think it's based on them doing the appropriate research and having the appropriate content that is reliable.
I would say the first question to ask is, like, why are you doing a podcast? Like, what's the purpose of it? Is it because you want to just put up content on your social media feed? Is it because you genuinely care about these topics? You want to educate someone about it? Do you love to teach, right? Because there's
education is key.
And there are some people who are natural born teachers. They love it, and it shows in the podcast. They love spreading that knowledge, and they're very good at it. And then there are some who are doing it because it's the trend to do podcasts right now. like when we started, we also did not plan for this really.
Right.
It came about as we were figuring out our bigger picture, and then we
Yes.
said, let's do this. And I was like, yo, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. Like, I'm not a host.
Well, we
at
did.
all,
Yeah, we did our research
right?
and figured it out.
And we learned along the way, and but then what we also did was we kept telling people or our audience is that this is what we're about, this is our end goal, this is our journey towards it. You know what I mean? And sometimes we've openly said with our guests and stuff, oh, we are not aware of this, or we are not familiar with this, and that's why
Yes.
we're growing as a
Absolutely.
as a brand.
But
and as a
but
team.
anything we do touch on, we will always have our resources.
But see, but that's us. But then at the same time, how many people did we run into who were also, oh, I'm starting up a podcast too. Oh, I'm doing this. You know what I mean? Like, it was just like, oh, okay.
Well, it's
Right?
because we mentioned the barriers to entry are really low. Like, it's not. If you spend 5 minutes researching how to do a podcast, you'll learn that it's really easy to put together.
It's really easy to put together, but it's
The work behind
the
the,
work
the
behind
resource,
it
finding the
is-
resources, making sure that your podcast has the quality, making sure your podcast has the right guests, and
and
you know,
growing
the
the
topics.
audience,
Oh, yeah.
and also making sure that the feedback that you get is taken into consideration, so you can build on it, grow on it, and sometimes you just end up carving out your niche, right? So I think it really comes down to that as a consumer, you need to question what you're listening to. And as someone who is thinking of doing a podcast or has a podcast, it's like, why am I doing this?
Yes.
Right? What's
So let's get back into that quote, because that was where we started.
yes.
Yeah. What's the why? Like, why are podcasts so popular? Are they beneficial to a brand? Releasing content and getting content out into the market, whatever your branding or business strategy is important, and finding the right ways for that to be done for your business is also very important. So we're going to get into that top 10 list that we talked about and talk about the top 10 reasons why podcasts are important. Rashi's just staring at me versus looking at her phone and starting to pull out the top 10 list. So we're going to get her to pull
I
out the
thought
top
you were
10
gonna
list.
say something like prior to that,
No?
because you had that look on your face, that like, oh, okay, I'm gonna say something else, and then but
So let's start off. So the topic is
okay. So 10 reasons why you need to add podcast to your content strategy, and we're gonna send the link of this article.
yeah, we'll have it in our description, so you'll have access to it. It'll also be on our Facebook page. Anywhere you just search Elevated Grapes, it'll show up.
So from a high level perspective, as we just spoke about, sometimes people do podcasts to add it as part of their content that they want to put out. But here we'll go into details as to why it's important.
Yep. So point number 1, and we'll read the bit of the description around it too.
Go for it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you have a nice, hosting
Podcasts
voice.
have low competition. The content marketplace is competitive, like really competitive. Successful digital marketers find big wins with their content when they find a content type or topic with high engagement and low competition. That's exactly what podcast provides. While there are around 800 million Facebook business pages, there are only 80 million Facebook pages, business pages. There are only 700,000 podcasts airing. The number shrinks when you search by topic. There may be only a handful of other podcasts discussing the topics relevant to your business, with hundreds to thousands of listeners. With this low competition, it's far easier to have your podcast stand out and gain listeners. So let's talk about that specific point alone. Do you think that podcasts have low competition?
Actually, no. I think it's quite the opposite. Just alone in the city that we're in, and people that we know, how many of them have podcasts?
Well, we run into quite a bit. Now, this just a note. This article was written in May 2019, which is about the time we started our podcasting.
Yeah.
And when we walked into it knowing that there's a lot of competition and a lot of people in this business. Now, our niche at that point was to specifically talk to men's styling, but then as we know that our podcast transformed a little bit and
that's
adds,
okay.
which is it's industry, it's lifestyle, it's all those sort of things. So yes, lifestyle has a huge, and when we discussed this, lifestyle is a huge marketplace in podcast. The fashion industry side does not as much as we thought it did when we did our research.
But now
there is still there, but it's still few and far between. Like there may be a handful that we've found that do the fashion industry topics, but which is okay. I mean that kind of competition is okay because you still want to make your niche and make your mark in that space. And then the fashion tips and styling. A year ago from today, there weren't as many, and a lot more popped up since then. If you like Google top 10 men's fashion styling podcasts, there's
tons.
A boatload that come up. So there's a lot of them. But that's why I think that we we focus on differentiating ourselves by offering a 3-tiered podcast
And I
setup.
and I also think a lot of it is just kind of based on our journey, and that was the purpose when we started our podcast. Is that this is our journey to our eventual goal, right? Like, or one of our eventual goals, I should
Yes.
say. Um, and it has been working out well for us, but I don't agree with the statement that podcasts have no competition. I recently someone that I guest right for decided to do a podcast as well, like or and doing similar things like I'm doing. And I was just like, okay. Again, another podcast has popped up. Or like in the last year alone, like when we started, a few months later, people that we knew were just like popping up podcasts, right? So it's just, I don't agree with the statement that there's low competition. I think there is competition. I think that we have faced situations where, you know, it's been very obvious that we're seen as competitors versus being as seen as colleagues
Partners,
in the same space, right? So yeah.
So I think it's industry specific. There's some areas that maybe are not as populated yet with podcasters, but there is definitely competition in the space. So you got to be mindful of that where you're going into. Now, again, if you don't really care and your point is to get your knowledge and your content across,
then
that's fine.
very different.
Then you do it anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So engaging and convenient for listeners. Podcasts require little effort to engage with listeners. On the listener's behalf. Unlike written blog content, which has to be read, or even videos that require audiences to sit and watch, all podcast listener has to do is hit play and listen. So this is actually very important. I think from an engagement, this is one of the reasons we initially started it. From an engagement standpoint and convenience to listeners, it is one of the easiest ways. I mean, getting content and the most convenient factor was one of our goals. I mean, you can write a book, but again, someone's got to be interested. Not that it doesn't work, but they have to do that. If you're writing a blog, again, someone's got to want to sit there and read. And that too, like you can't do that when you're driving. You can't do that on the go. You can't do that while you're doing other tasks. So a podcast, you can, like they said, you can use one of the streaming sites, hit play, and go about your day. If you're cooking in the kitchen, you're having it in the background, you can do that too, because there's so many easy ways to set up, a speaker, whether it's a, Google Home or whatever, or Bluetooth. So I think it creates an easy, convenient way to get content out to your listener.
It does, and yes, I agree with the whole you hit play and you listen. But my question is, are you listening while you're doing something? So are you really retaining the knowledge, or
of course,
are you
of course. I think we live in a multitasking sort of environment where people are doing multiple things at one time. I know I do that too. So if I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking up dinner, sometimes you could listen to the radio, but sometimes you could also pop this on. I listen to a lot of talk radio when I'm driving or before I go to bed. So I think those are podcasts usually before I go to bed, and talk radio when I'm driving. And so I think content in that manner is so much easier, because when I'm driving, I don't want to be distracted, or whatever. If I want to listen to music, or if I want to listen to a discussion about a specific topic, I have that option. And that's why I think it's very important. It's very convenient, because it gives you access to this information when you're doing other things, and when you can actually focus while you're engaging in other activities.
I'm still a reader, so
Yeah, so you're definitely gonna come from that standpoint.
Yeah, that's very, very different.
Okay, so let's go into number 3. Another mobile-friendly content option. Part of the low-effort multitasking richness of podcasts is due to how mobile-friendly this medium is. As mentioned, I enjoy listening to my favorite. I don't know why we're talking about this person, but we're going to give her stat for now. She enjoys listening to her favorite podcast during her commute on smartphone, and she's 69%. Sorry, she's not alone. 69% of podcast listeners are on their mobile devices. As we increasingly choose mobiles devices over other technologies, adopting mobile-friendly content types is important. It's easy for podcast listeners to consume this content while they're on the move, whether at the gym, car, relaxing home, etc., etc. Now, they're basically talking about what we're talking about over a blog. But I think that's, going back to the early point, I think that's what's so important. And I forgot about the gym aspect. A lot of people, hate running on the treadmill, but you put a podcast on that's an hour long, and they're running on the treadmill. It's an engaging topic. That hour goes by a lot quicker. It helps you to go through certain things also, and for example, like a workout, and also still get content while you're doing that. Like I know a lot of people that specifically will listen to it during their workouts. They'll have a couple, or even like, for example, those that commute by train.
Yeah.
Boom, you just kind of hit the download on a lot of these streaming apps. They allow you to download it onto your phone, so you can listen to it offline.
I've done that too. Like there's certain podcasts that I've enjoyed listening while I'm driving or I'm on the train, and then there's sometimes I like to just read or whatever, right? So that, I do understand the convenience of having a podcast on.
So it's important, because we have to remember, we're talking about this in terms of delivering content from a brand strategy standpoint. So from a delivering content standpoint, I think it's in having that convenience for your audience is very important.
Yeah, and it does go back to what we had spoken about originally, but again, it the bottom line comes down to is why is there a podcast, and the way it's received by consumers. Not to say that this is not a good thing that's growing, because it's trending, it's growing, and in fact, podcasts have are now going towards the whole ads and getting sponsors on them and things like that.
A lot of the popular ones have a lot of sponsored ads on them.
Yeah.
So this is to that point. So point number 4 in this article is growing in popularity. The number of podcast listeners is growing. There were 48 million weekly podcast listeners in 2018, according to Statista. The audience is expected to grow to 115 million by 2021. So I mean, it's more than almost tripling. It's more than doubling.
Mhm.
From 2018 to 2021. This is a big turning point for podcasts, and it's an important time period for marketers looking to begin creating a podcast. Now is the time to get started. Blah blah. Who cares about that? Getting into podcast game now will allow you to beat the crowd. And okay, this is just like an opinion, so I don't care. I like this article because it sheds some good stats. So to her point, it's 115 million by 2021 from 48 million. So in 3 years, I mean, it's more than doubling. And if you think about that from a brand strategy standpoint or an audience standpoint, people look, the availability of content is everywhere. And where do you want to get content? So streaming, convenience on a mobile app because your mobile is usually always with you. A lot of cars, they activate that Bluetooth, and so it's easy to to drop it on your car and play it now. Um, there's a reason why we're seeing that growth.
Yeah. Going back to this point, podcast audience are extremely loyal as well, which I think you and I both have personally experienced that.
You're jumping topics.
No, I'm saying yes, I agree with you.
Okay, so we're done that topic. So now we're not going back to a point. We're starting a new point.
Yeah, I agree. I don't always have to,
No, but then let's segue. Since you're a host, we're going to segue into the next topic. Right, since we've got to segue. So now we're going to go into point number 5. Podcast audiences are extremely loyal. You got to let your audience know what's going on. You can't just start the topic.
Well, again, I am getting training in being a co-host, even though I've been doing this for a year, but I was never called a co-host. But now, since I'm calling myself, I'm getting training on it.
And if you're going to be a co-host, we got to make sure you do things like a host.
Aren't you so sweet about that?
Yeah, we're going to talk about this later. Developing a podcast audience ahead of the competition is incredibly important because listeners are loyal to their favorite programs, which is very true. You and I can talk about a number of podcasts that we listen to regularly, and there are go-tos, right? They establish relationships with the hosts and want to check back each time there's a new podcast episode, which again is true. We've heard that feedback with our own podcast.
Yeah.
If you can establish a strong audience before the podcast boom, it will be hard for your competitors to attract those listeners to their own shows, which is true. We see that in other markets too. If someone's started in the YouTube game early, like they're doing very well now. It's hard to jump into that game now. This loyalty also translates to other marketing channels. For example, podcast listeners are 20% more likely to connect with a brand on social media. So, which is also true. One of the things we've heard from our partners is, that fact that they use their products in other podcasts, and they wanted to engage and use ours with their brand too, because they found that having it mentioned over a series of podcasts, it gives them access to a different audience, which will engage to their Instagram handle.
And to that point, having having a loyal audience, they also trust what you're saying, which goes back to my point is that how consumers receive the information, then they feel that they can approach, that you are approachable, and then they want to know what is part of your lifestyle, right? So if you are going to talk about a product or a service, then they want to be part of that. They want to be part of your brand.
Exactly. And I think the main point that brings us to that is the loyalty and engagement with the host. So we've heard a number of times, we like listening to you guys because it's just the way you guys interact with each other, and that keeps us coming back. So it's, they'll enjoy the topics, but they enjoy the engagement, the way we deliver our content as well. So when you're building your own podcast brand, you got to think about that. Like, what is your draw? Like, what is what's going to bring people in over and over to listen to? Obviously, you're targeting a market, so they may be in the market to listen to your content. But if there's 30 other podcasts providing the exact same content, what's going to differentiate you and bring you that audience?
To that point, I still don't understand this whole interaction aspect of it, but sure.
We're too crazy talking about crazy shit.
There you go.
So point number 6, interactive options for the audience. So one of the reasons that podcasts are so engaging and foster such loyal audiences is because they are very interactive. Hosts can create audience polls, answer questions, and take calls. Just like a traditional radio show, this helps pull listeners into the show and makes consuming the content feel more like an interactive experience rather than simply listening to audio. So on our podcast, we don't do the call-ins because our podcasts are pre-recorded. So we bring in guests, but there are ways to do the podcast live. And if you do at a specific time, you can have an audience, just like a radio show.
And we've done live before, and we
Sure.
used to have people who would give in their
Engage,
comments,
yeah,
and
over
they'd
social media.
come and then they say, "Yay!"
But we have
Yeah,
used
yeah,
our
yeah.
podcast to create polls and create engagement on social media. So
Yeah.
yes, it can be used for that. If we're talking about a topic and we want people's feedback, we will use social media. So it can definitely create engagement, which is, again, from a business branding standpoint, it's a great way to take the type of content and relate it back to your product.
Agreed.
So number 7, scalable costs for the creators. Now this is also very important because we talked about this in one of our other
Our goals and dreams podcast.
So sometimes it's not necessarily, there's different ways to look at costs. So in terms of creation costs, podcasts are scalable like photo and video content. The cost to create is really dependent on the quality. Smartphones shoot exceptional videos and photos, but if you want to raise that content to the next level, then you need to invest more in expensive equipment. Same goes true for podcasts. You can capture good audio with relatively cheap equipment, but on Amazon, I don't know why she calls out Amazon. However, the quality may not be up to par with audiences that are used to long-established podcasts. As you develop your audience, you may decide to increase your podcast budget to include more expensive equipment. So it does make a difference. We're getting the warning that we have a few minutes. It does make a difference in your equipment. And we run into that problem all the time because sometimes it's the environment. We'll shoot in different environments and we'll use the exact same equipment. And sometimes we'll get an amazing audio output with little editing. And sometimes, the environment has caused a bunch of background noise and we do our best to edit out the content, but sometimes it becomes a challenge.
And now more so because podcast is getting popular. There are libraries. There are
other digital information hubs and content places where you can record.
Yeah, or like you give a membership fee for like a year or something, and you can access all their equipment and things like that. So basically, the resources to do your podcast is available. Again, just go back to the point as to why you are doing this podcast and what's the purpose. Like from a person who wants to start a podcast, why am I doing this? What's the purpose? How consistent can I be? And then as an audience perspective is question what you listen to, just because that makes you less lazy essentially.
So we're going to quickly just mention the other 3 because we described it's going to be a top 10. So we'll mention them and we'll give our final thoughts on them. So establishing thought leadership is a benefit of having a podcast. That's point number 8. Point number 9 is disposable income demographics. The average listener earns around $10,000 more, or average in the U.S. So this is a U.S.-based poll. According to the 2016 report on podcast consumers, and 15% of listeners earn over $150,000. So this is just a quick note on demographics. And content, number 10, content publishing consistency. All of your blog posts and other content pieces should be scheduled, but audiences may not ever take notice like they will with the podcast. If your podcast airs on the same day each week or on the same time each day, listeners will get used to that schedule. They'll expect and anticipate the release of each podcast episode. So that's very important. That's a very important point. One of the things that we were told when we started is that make sure whatever you do it consistently. Don't break that consistency because that goes to your credibility and reliability.
And somehow we've been managing to drop our podcast, every Tuesdays, no matter what.
All right, so we're going to get into our final thoughts before we close here. And we have, I think, about 30 seconds now, correct? 30 seconds, so Rashi? Okay, so we found it to be a very applicable to us given our journey, and we think that everything that we just mentioned in there's benefits to it. I do think you have to consider the costs. I do think you have to consider your schedule, and I do think you have to just consider your audience to make sure your podcast is effective. There's always competition, but do your research.
The only thing I do not agree with this article is the content publishing consistency part, because yes, podcast has to be consistent, but your blog posts, your Instagram posts, there are so many resources out there that those are also consistent, and audiences do follow that before the podcast trend happens. So so the overall message is that if you are going to have a podcast, be consistent. Know why you're doing this and the purpose of this, and if it's going to be the audience, just question what you're listening to.
So Rashi took 45 seconds. All right, folks, thank you for tuning in to Elevated Grapes. I am your host, Sethi. Rashi's going to give her a 45-second spiel, and then she's out.
This is your fashion consultant and your stylist, Rashi Bindra. Bye. Can you wait before I finish for getting up?
Hey guys, thank you for watching that podcast or that video. If you like what you hear and you want to hear more of us and see some of our behind-the-scenes stuff, subscribe below.
Yes, hit that little red, button thingy that's over there and hit subscribe and keep following us for a lot more cool, fun stuff.
Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you soon.